they would have public debates, disputed questions, where they would get two scholars together and just argue back and forth. They didn't even have the internet at the time, so there were no cat videos to watch. They had to do something with all their time. But Aquinas wrote more words than you'll find in the Encyclopedia Britannica in the course of about 25 years. And we'll talk a little bit about his life this evening. There is a tradition in the Roman colleges, which everybody loved, known as the Lectio Brevis. The first class was always a little bit shorter, and then they lowered the boom after that. So this evening, we'll talk a little bit about who St. Thomas Aquinas was. And you can get the bare facts, but to have some sense of the tenor of the times in which he lived and the revolutions, really, of which he was a part, and how pivotal it was in the course of the history of Europe and the history of the church. Why Aquinas matters. We'll talk a little bit about philosophy and theology and how they interact or don't, and we'll get to that in more detail as time goes on. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the resources that we have here. Does anybody have a doctorate in Thomistic philosophy or theology? Gary does. This makes me a little nervous. No matter how bad this gets, and it will be a little challenging at times, you can console yourself knowing it's not dental ethics. When I was in this PhD program in St. Louis University had a school of advanced dentistry. These were already people with a doctoral degree in dentistry, and they were going into periodontics, orthodontics, and endodontics. And 2 weeks before this class on dental ethics was to begin, whoever was supposed to teach it backed out. And so they called the Center for Healthcare Ethics and said, we need a teacher. So somehow it ended up being me. It was an absolute catastrophe. 8 o'clock on Monday mornings in a new classroom that was filled with technology that never really worked. Every week we'd be like 15 or 20 minutes late because the guy would have to run across the campus from IT. Half of the students spoke English as a second language. It was an absolute catastrophe. So no matter how bad this gets, it won't be dental ethics. Maybe we can start, just kind of introduce yourself, what parish you're from, and what's your favorite quote from St. Thomas Aquinas? George. You can leave the last part out.
George Riddelove, it's my wife Mary Ann, and we're from Holy Spirit Church.
Okay, let me pick out my favorite.
In Latin.
In Latin.
Thank you for doing that. Mary Lovin, my husband Gary, and we also are from Holy Spirit Parish.
Thank you. Mary?
I'm Mary Koenig, and I also am from Holy Spirit. My husband couldn't come tonight, but he sent me good wishes for you in Latin.
That's wonderful. Urban?
Urban Torbert from Holy Spirit.
Constance Crane from the Sacred Heart. Roxanne from Holy Spirit.
Frank and Jeannie Barnaby, newly Sacred Heart.
Yes. And they were the ones, I think you guys started this whole thing, right?
Oh, I think Mary Ann.
Oh, did you?
Sorry.
Well, she said you did, so. Okay.
John and Anita Storing from Sacred Heart.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Tom Schutz, Sacred Heart, and my favorite Aquinas quote. Grant, O merciful God, that I may ardently desire, fruitfully examine, truthfully acknowledge, and perfectly accomplish what is pleasing to thee for the praise and glory of thy name.
That's not bad. Thank you. Now I'm doubly intimidated.
Joe Schmitz from Sacred Heart. When I was a freshman at St. John's, I took a philosophy class, and I didn't know who Chesterton was, but I read a book by Chesterton. The only thing I remember was the title, St. Thomas Aquinas, the Dumb Ox. And I vaguely recall that he refuted the title as he wrote the book.
Yes, here it is. Chesterton's biography. We'll get back to that because it really is excellent.
I'm Jean, his wife.
From Sacred Heart.
Joe Walnut was Sacred Heart.
Good to see you here.
Robert Splicky, Sacred Heart.
Going back.
I'm Deacon Terry Jansen, and this is my wife Barb, both from Sacred Heart.
I'm Jerry Waterfoot, and I'm from Sacred Heart, and the only thing I found in here that I understood was out of confusion.
Was what?
Out of confusion, it's like,
Oh, yes.
that's not a quote, but you know,
It's a good place to start.
it seems to me. That was in Latin too.
I'm Jackie Kopp from Annunciation.
Joe Presley, Sacred Heart.
Joe's our IT guy this evening, too.
He has a couple of hats.
Come to the front.
Ian Koshinina, my wife Kathy, would want to say Michael's thing about it.
And
Okay.
Karen Pierce, Sacred Heart.
We left you guys for last.
John Howard, Holy Spirit.
And Sarah, his wife.
Marjorie
Holy
Ford,
Spirit.
Holy Spirit.
All right, thank you. I don't know who's on live stream, but we'll all wave. Thank you all for joining. So as I mentioned, this is going to get at places a little heavy, and there will be some difficulties, not because you are not capable of learning it, because I'm not capable of teaching it in the all of the rigor that it deserves. St. Thomas, you know a lot about philosophy already. You know a lot about Aquinas already, even though you may not know that you know it. So my encouragement is just to kind of coast along. Whatever sticks, that's fine. When I was in grad school in philosophy, I had the rule that if I read the same paragraph 3 times and none of it sunk in, I'd just move on, because it couldn't be that important. You read Immanuel Kant in the sunshine, in a nice comfortable chair, and then it's just kind of, it all made sense until you really woke up. And then none of it made sense. So philosophy really is about, you do it all the time. Why? The kind of fundamental philosophical question is to understand why things are, why they are at all, why they are the way they are, how they could be different, how to get to what might be different, how we ought to live, where things came from, where they're going, all the questions that sort of occupy our minds at various levels and different times are philosophical questions. So here you have just a few quotes, and Augustine said this actually. Fide, what is theology? Theology is fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. And philosophy is also that begins with awe or wonder, the question why. It's the fundamental human question. Your dog may have differences of opinion with you about supper or about being on the couch, but they don't really get to that point of saying, why do you have all these rules? What's the point? What's the reason? Where is my life going? You know, the human person is unique in that sense, as we will see in Aquinas. Credo ut intelligam is to the statement that I believe that I might understand. So you think of the scientific worldview, which is even of people who are not very scientific, but it's very prominent in our culture. I need to understand before I will believe. And things that of faith, when you can go online and Google something and in 1/10 of a second, you can get 1.5 million responses, it's very hard to wait for God to reveal things to us and to learn little by little and by experience. So in an impatient world, credo ut intelligam, to believe so that gradually I might come to an understanding, is an important step. We'll talk more later on about how reason and revelation fit, because it really was Aquinas' whole point here. Okay. Do any of it. Show me, Joe.
Full screen. The full screen, I just tap on that one for now.
The slideshow.
Yeah, you can do it that way too, from the beginning.
Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you. So who was Saint Thomas Aquinas? Aquinas was born, we're not exactly sure, around 1224 or 1225, near Aquino, a town called Roca Seca. So I put this map up. You see where Rome is? Gives you a sense of where Italy is, and then Naples down at the south. It's about halfway in between. And Monte Cassino, the famous Benedictine Abbey, is right in near Roca Seca, and that will become important momentarily. And then he died March 7th, 1274, not far from where he was born. Aquinas traveled all over Europe. He was in Cologne in Germany. He was in Paris a number of different times. He traveled to different parts, and we'll see this, of Italy in service to the popes. But he died and was born in the same neighborhood, really. Then he was canonized in 1323 by, look how long it took to get a John the 23rd. John the 22nd in the 14th century, John the 23rd not until 1959. There's the young Aquinas. I think that was his yearbook picture, maybe. He was the youngest of 8 children, born to the Count of Aquino, a guy named Landulf, and his mother was Theodora. She was a countess. Why is that important? So Thomas was one of 8 children, and his second cousin was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick II. I think he was a grand nephew of another emperor. So there were just a lot of connections. Aquinas was well situated in terms of the royalty and the power seat of that part of Italy. And so the presumption was his brothers were all sort of like if Stearns County and Benton County and Sherburne County were all at war with each other and disputing boundaries and kind of always trying to get a little more land so they could raise more taxes and have more feudal vassals and things like that. There was a lot of power struggle going on. Thomas, this rather robust, he wasn't fat. Don't let anybody tell you he was fat. He was just large. And he was different than his brothers because he wasn't very militant and he wasn't very interested in these battles and things. He was quiet, thoughtful. And his father didn't quite know what to do with him. He wasn't much of a soldier, didn't really have very good skill with the sword and bow and arrow and crossbow. So he thought, well, we'll make him the abbot of Monte Cassino. Remember, this is high royal family kind of stuff. So it was a path laid out for Aquinas. Would have been easy to enter into that kind of power. And this was a time when the church had a lot of power in the civil order as well. It was a path laid out for him that he would have authority, power, and easy life. He didn't do it. He wanted, so they sent him to the Benedictine Abbey when he was 5. He was there for about 8 years. And then the political situation in the area led him to return to the University of Naples, or to Naples, where there was another Benedictine monastery, and he spent another 5 years there. And then somehow he encountered the Dominicans. So remember the time of Francis and Dominic. Francis of Assisi, and this is the substance of this book at the beginning, where Chesterton talks about these 2 friars, Francis and Aquinas. And they both had a profound influence in the kind of reinvigoration of the faith in Europe in different ways. Lots of people know a lot about, or think and know a lot about Francis and his love of nature and his love of poverty and simplicity. There was, of course, more to St. Francis than just standing by bird baths. And there's more to Aquinas as well than just sitting in a room writing philosophy. So he was on this track to become a powerful Benedictine abbot. And he joins the Dominicans. So the Benedictines had existed from the time of Saint Benedict, sometime in the 6th century. And this order grew, and you go to St. John's and you see what it's like to have a monastic community where you have land and you have a stable place and you become sort of a center of an area for agriculture, industry, learning, kind of a center of culture and business and economics in a place. And then you have Francis and Dominic, who became mendicants or begging orders. They didn't have monasteries at the time. The idea was that the friars would go out into the community and preach and evangelize and spread the gospel. And you can understand that the Benedictines and the local bishops didn't really appreciate it. All these guys who were very eloquent and very popular and very profitable people were supporting them with donations, these beggars, rather than supporting the monasteries or the local parishes. We would have the same problem today if these people showed up and took our money from our collections. And so there was a great controversy around the mendicant orders. And Thomas spent much of his career at the beginning defending the mendicant way of life. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. But he ran into the Dominicans, wanted to become a Dominican, walked into his father's room and said, I'm going to be a Dominican, which was a completely different path, a career path. It seemed like utter failure against everything the family stood for and the path that was laid out for him. So simply, why would he turn his back on this? So his family, his brothers, at least a couple of brothers, waylaid him, kidnapped him, and held him captive for a year to try and get him to change his mind. And as Chesterton says, maybe Aquinas didn't much care whether I sit in a dungeon or a cell, I can still write and philosophize and think, you know. And to try and break his spirit, this is one image of this. They sent in this, so Aquinas, Chesterton's a temptress, a woman of ill repute, however you want to say it, to sort of break his spirit and get him to go against these vows of chastity and simplicity and all that. This was the one time, his biographers will say, where Aquinas moved rapidly. He grabs a brand out of the fireplace and chases her out with this. She, of course, is a little shocked because he was a big guy. This is not what I signed up for. And marked with this smoking brand a big cross on the door. Never saw her again, of course. And his brothers eventually, and his father, saw his absolute commitment to the mendicant way of life and relented, and he became a Dominican. He was released in 1245, entered the Dominicans, and he studied in Paris under Saint Albert the Great. Why is this important? So Chesterton will talk about this, other biographers will talk about this. Christian faith grew up and became in a part of the world where Greek philosophy, and you can see this in some of Paul's writings, was prominent. And the early Christians wrestled with reconciling what they knew of Greek philosophy, mostly through Plato, the Greek philosopher Plato, and we'll talk more about this next time, with Christian faith. And the idea of the word, the logos, logos, where we get the word theology, means word, that the word was made flesh in the incarnation. Much of the early Christian thought tended toward spiritual, kind of otherworldly thought, and rooted in Platonism to some extent, or Neoplatonism, come back to that as well. But one of the things Chesterton points out is that Albert and Aquinas sort of recovered reason, science, observation, common sense, the world we actually encounter, to bring into dialogue with faith, as opposed to kind of abstract ideas or overly spiritualized Christianity. To us, it seems pretty obvious to say, why is the incarnation important? That Jesus took on our human nature, had a body like this, that the sacraments use things of creation, water and bread and wine and oil. Why is that important? To our understanding of that comes largely through Aquinas, not solely, but largely through Aquinas, and preceded by Albert the Great, who came to know Aristotle. You have to know a little bit, we'll come back to Greek philosophy next time, a little bit about the succession of ideas. Whereas Plato had the idea that the really real is the abstract world of the ideas or forms, and material things were more of an obstacle than a means to knowledge. They got in your way to really know things. Aristotle was maybe one of the first scientists, if you will, an empiricist. I look at the world around me and I explore it. I believe that the world can communicate something of the truth to me. Not the whole truth, but important truth. The world, the material things that we see are not problems, they are clues or keys into truth of a certain kind. And this led to a lot of controversy, as you might understand, from some kind of entrenched worldviews. Does that sound familiar? Across intellectual history. And it brought into question the relationship between reason, science, faith, theology, how do matter and spirit interact? Do they have anything to say one to another? 1248, he goes to Cologne, where it was a Roman city, and there was a university there, to establish a Dominican school. Albert the Great took him along. It was Albert who, so Aquinas was kind of slow and very quiet. Slow not intellectually, but he was just kind of appeared a little lethargic and dull to his classmates. And so they gave him the name, this dumb ox, because he was a fairly big guy compared to the rest of them. And dumb, not stupid, but dumb in the sense of he didn't speak. He wouldn't say much. He was always very quiet, listening, attentive. So they just kind of thought, not much going on up there. You know? And it was Albert who first saw in Aquinas this depth of intellectual insight and gave him a few little jobs. And there's one story Chesterton tells where one of his classmates, kind of pitying St. Thomas, thought, boy, this guy needs some help. So he's going to tutor him a little bit in logic. And he's explaining things to Aquinas and gets to a point where he realizes, I don't know what I'm talking about. And then St. Thomas very carefully lays out the next 8 points. And this student was a little bit taken aback. Albert saw this in Aquinas and drew out his gifts and his talents and saw this deep intellect. And so it was to Albert that the quote is often attributed. You might call him a dumb ox, but someday the bellowing of this dumb ox will fill the earth. So here we are studying Aquinas 750 years later. He was sent to Paris for doctoral studies, earned the title of Magister, which would be like a doctorate in our day, taught at the University of Paris. He became known to the popes, a series of popes who engaged him as their theologian. Alexander IV, Urban IV, and then it was for Urban IV, it actually was the last year of his life, I believe, that he composed the liturgy for Corpus Christi. Urban wanted a new feast in the church to honor the body and blood of Christ, the Eucharist. And it was to Aquinas. So we often think of him as kind of this cold, rational thinker, very logical. He was a poet. He was a composer. He had an artistic heart as well. And so the Tantum Ergo, the Adorate Devote, the songs that we sing, the Lauda Zion, the sequence for Corpus Christi, all of that is from Aquinas. A very deep insight, not just to theology, but the love of God, the beauty, the mystery of the faith. In 1265, I studied in Rome with the Dominicans, so we learned to love St. Thomas, of course. And up on the hill, you can look across the Tiber, and there you see St. Peter's, is Santa Sabina. It's an old Roman church. It's one of the few Roman churches that was not redone in the Baroque. So it's still a very simple appearance on the interior. It's always the station church every Ash Wednesday. So there were 40 churches that were designated in Rome, and the popes would go around and have Mass at one of those different martyr churches every day. And that tradition still continues in Rome, the station churches during Lent. Santa Sabina was always the first. And Aquinas lived there for at least a short time. Then he went to Viterbo in Rome under the next pope, Clement IV. 1268, he goes back to Rome. And this is one of the pivotal debates. There was a theologian there, you see, that's his yearbook picture on the top, I think, Siger of Brabant, who was an Aristotelian, but understand, the Romans knew Aristotle. Remember the Dark Ages, you know, where there was a lot of, Rome fell, the Vandals and the Goths, and everybody sort of overran the Italian peninsula. And so it's often called the Dark Ages, that there was a lot of learning lost to those generations. Not completely, because they kept that intellectual tradition alive, but some of the resources that they would have had disappeared to their use. In the East, the Muslim philosophers had access to Aristotle, the Greek texts of Aristotle. And so they translated into Latin the Aristotelian texts. And that's how Aquinas came to know Aristotle, through those Muslim philosopher translations. And as he's reading them, he says, there's some things that are wrong here. And so Siger was an Aristotelian, but with a very Muslim bent on this. And particularly two things. One, the idea of individual immortality. And second, the intellect. So the Muslim interpretation of Aristotle was that there was one kind of unimind, there was one divine intellect that was joined to the human intellect, and there's a single intellect for every person. Okay, it sounds odd to us, hopefully, but that was their belief. And Aquinas said, no, no, no. Every person has their own intellect. It might be similar, it has a common nature, but everyone has their own mind, opinions, knowledge. There's not just a single mind. Because if you have just one mind, then individual immortality, the resurrection, also wouldn't make any sense. That individuals would also rise again. So Aquinas saw these two errors and argued with Siger about this. And really it was about the autonomy, the freedom of reason. How does philosophy relate to theology? Siger had the idea, and there were some, Avicenna and Averroes, you'll often hear of those two Muslim philosophers that Aquinas encountered through their writing. And the idea that you could have two different kinds of truth. There could be something true in philosophy and false in theology, and the other way around. So that there's these two ideas of what is true, and they don't intersect. They might be completely opposite of each other. And you just had to learn two things. And sometimes you'd be right and sometimes you'd be wrong, but you're never really sure depending on which camp you're in. So can the truth of revelation be completely contradictory to the truth of reason? So maybe in science, if you drop something, gravity will make it fall. But maybe not so in theology. Maybe that has completely different rules. Maybe God isn't bound to the rules that he has made for his own creation. And still we did some study a little bit in Islamic ethics in healthcare, because we sometimes encounter patients who come from that tradition, and trying to understand how they would view our ideas about Western medicine, not even just Christian faith, but Western medicine. And their approach is much more authoritarian what the Quran says. Christian faith tends to be certainly the Bible, but the Bible is reasonable. It intersects with the world as we know it. And so you see that tension even today in how philosophy and theology, reason and revelation might intersect. Aquinas didn't know Greek well, and he didn't know Hebrew apparently at all. And so his knowledge of these texts comes from others, other translations, and as we'll see, also through St. Augustine, who he loved, admired, but sometimes disagreed with. 1272, he goes back to Naples to establish a Dominican house of studies there. So you're about 2 years away from his death. And it is at this time that that famous incident occurred where he's in his cell and Jesus from the crucifix speaks to Aquinas and says, "You've written well of me, Thomas, what do you desire?" And his answer, "Non nihil, nothing but you, O Lord." And his biographer, Weisseipel, is a Dominican, will talk about this as a stroke, probably. Contemporary science would say he had a stroke because afterwards his speech was slurred, his gait was somewhat affected, the speed of his reason had slowed down. He had kind of the droop to his face. Of course, they didn't know much about cardiovascular science at the time and all of the medical things. And it's not unreasonable to think that they happened at the same time, that this vision and the physical effect, it would be so appropriate for Aquinas that faith and theology and science and the world around him would come into intersect in that way. After that time, he stopped writing. And he said after that compared to the vision of Jesus, speaking to him, everything he had written was so much straw compared to the reality of the person of Christ, despite all his brilliant insight into Christ. Then in 1274, he's called by Pope Gregory X to the Council of Lyon in France, and Bonaventure was there as well. They were good friends, the Franciscan theologian Bonaventure. And he's on his way to the council and has another episode, maybe another stroke, and dies in Fossa Nova. Even during his life, there was controversy. There were people who thought that, powerful people like the Archbishop of Paris, who also had charge over the University of Paris, that this Aristotle guy, I mean, you start with Aristotle and pretty soon you'll be worshiping Apollo. It's anti-Christian. You cannot be doing this. This is contrary to the faith. And so a lot of Aquinas' energy, along with some of the other Dominicans, was defending Aristotle, not as the carrier of all truth, but as a philosophy that could lead you into understanding God and Scripture through the world around us. And you say, for an incarnational sacramental faith, that makes perfect sense. He was not uncritical of Aristotle. He was a very careful reader of Aristotle, but he saw there a system, a structure that was easily aligned with explaining revelation, not completely bracketing miraculous things or supernatural things, but the foundation in nature for the supernatural to act. Aquinas, one of his sayings is that grace builds on nature. It's not contrary to nature, it builds on nature. And so we would say, and I think we can understand that today, this is conducive to Aquinas' thought, that being a Christian doesn't make you less human, but more human. Following Christ doesn't mean that you have to abandon your humanity. It means you live it more intensely. That insight would be from St. Thomas. So the Archbishop of Paris, who was more sympathetic to the Franciscans than the Dominicans, condemned the writing of Aquinas. And there were other, like 211 theses or statements that he condemned as heretical, and about a dozen of those were from Aquinas. And everybody kind of ignored it by that time. And bishops are maybe used to that. And then after his death, all of that, and after he was canonized, all of that was rescinded. So it's good to know that Aquinas, the great theologian, was banned in the church at one point. The Council of Trent, 16th century, after the Reformation and Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and Knox and the Reformers, and the church was faced with defining its dogma and its doctrine more clearly in the face of these objections. Aquinas was cited in the Summa second only to the Bible in the documents of the council, which says something about how much they trusted his insight. So as I mentioned, he's canonized, declared a doctor of the church after the Council of Trent. Pope Leo XIII wrote a document on Christian philosophy, Aeterni Patris. We often think of Leo in association with Rerum Novarum and the rights of workers and Catholic social thought. That's certainly true. But he also had a great love for Aquinas and held him out as a model in the wake of some trends in philosophy, and we'll talk more about that next time, that he wanted to counter. And so he held out Aquinas as a model to follow for a safe guidance through theology. And Aquinas, other than St. Joseph and Mary, and then when we talk about the feasts of Peter and Paul, he's the only saint mentioned in the Code of Canon Law by name. Canon 252 is about theological formation and that we should follow the sure guidance of St. Thomas. After Aeterni Patris, then, in the late 19th, early 20th century, and it's still going on, there was a movement called Neo-Thomism, or Neo-Scholasticism, as it's sometimes called. You had some famous figures, if you know a little bit about philosophy, Étienne Gilson, Jacques Maritain, Garrigou Lagrange, French and Italian philosophers. Benedict Ashley, who died not long ago, he was a Dominican. He was one of our professors in this PhD program. He was a short little guy with a really remarkable intellect and knowledge of Aquinas. And particularly, Ashley's strength was the history of philosophy, how these ideas filter down and one philosopher is reacting against another. Until you know what this guy was talking about or the context of his comments from the people before him, it's hard to situate a philosopher. It's always this kind of dialogue. It's like turning on the TV in the middle of the movie. You don't know what came before, and so you can't quite situate yourself in the story. That was Ashley's great strength. John Canassis was one of my professors as well in Houston when I was in a program there. I didn't know he was famous until afterwards. And both Augustine and Aquinas quotes this and changes it a little bit. The study of philosophy is not that we may know what men have thought, but what the truth of things is. So very often when you study philosophy in college or seminary, it's about the history of philosophy. Who said what and how did all this kind of evolve? That's important, but it's also frustrating because you say some of these guys are really dumb. How'd they come up with this stuff? But you gotta kind of know. And when you're looking for, just tell me what I need to know to get ordained, you know, this gets a little burdensome. But it really is helpful to know not only what great thinking has happened, but what errors people have gone down, what wrong paths. Jude Doherty is a professor at Catholic U, who was speaking of Immanuel Kant, and we'll talk about next time, said Kant was a brilliant man. He just got on the wrong train and never got off. Why does St. Thomas matter? Thomas matters for a variety of reasons, and Chesterton touches on some of them. The harmony of faith and reason, that we are able to be persons who can appreciate science, technology, history, psychology, all of the disciplines that come from reason, and we can appreciate art, and we can appreciate nature's beauty, and be believers in God. We don't have to choose between the two or set them in opposition to one another. They have to be properly ordered and aligned, but they're not opposed to one another. And the things that we know by reason coincide with the things that we know by faith. The things that we learn authentically by reason are truths. They're not the whole truth. But faith does not ask us to believe anything that is unreasonable or contrary to reason. And we'll come back to that in some detail because Aquinas goes to great pains to show how this is true. The truths of faith and the truths of reason coincide. The goodness of created reality and the body. Again, Chesterton will talk about this, how philosophy or theology had sort of drifted away into more abstract ideas, and the groundedness and rootedness of the created world became sort of secondary to that. It was about saving your soul, and the body was just sort of this problem that you had. For Aquinas, the body and the soul are a unity. The body is more limited than the soul. The soul is the form or the identity, the rationale for having, it informs the body that makes an individual body a person, but they're not completely separable. And you see all of this in John Paul II's Theology of the Body. He goes into great detail and relies very strongly on Aquinas in making this case. It's what grounds the incarnation. It's what grounds the sacramental order. It's what grounds the idea of resurrection. So for Plato, for instance, one of his famous sayings was in Greek, soma sema, that the body is like a tomb or a prison that holds you back from the really real. And the goal of philosophy is to escape the body and live just in the mind, the ideas. That should sound anti-Christian, certainly opposed to the idea of the incarnation and the presence of Christ still in the world, in the body of Christ, the church, and in the sacramental order. So Aquinas sort of helped rescue the goodness of creation and the reality that we encounter. The reliability of human knowledge, but also its limitations. When we talk about Aristotle, we'll talk a little bit about the four causes and how science can bring you truth that is real, but not complete. And we live in a modern and postmodern world where science and technology have become sort of the measure of truth. If you can verify it, if you can prove it, if you can replicate the experiment, then it's true. Otherwise, it's not. And philosophy wrestled and continues to wrestle for a long time with what do you do with these obscure truths like good and sin and forgiveness and grace and redemption. Those have no real holding place in this worldview. And yet we encounter them and live them every day. So you get a guy like Wittgenstein who says, these kind of things you just have to pass over in silence. That's really the coward's way out. Might be true, I don't know, I just don't talk about it. So you can see the limitations then of our human knowledge. One of the things that is really remarkable about Aquinas, which would be so nice for our world today, the whole Summa is built around engaging the arguments others have made. So the Summa goes like this. There is a statement, a question, whether God exists. And then he will give arguments for one side or the other. So it would seem that videtur quod, it would seem that God does not exist. And then he gives a reason that is based in the thought or opinion of some philosopher, thinker, trend of thought. And then he lists 3 or 4 or 5 of those. Then he would say, sed contra est, on the other hand, and then he would introduce a contrary opinion from somebody else. And then the body of it always was respondio. However, I respond, and then he lays out his argument, and then he answers the objections one by one. So instead of just saying those people are dumb, or don't listen to them, or don't pay any attention to them, he had a really encyclopedic knowledge of all the trends of thought about all of these questions. He studied the people he disagreed with. He didn't simply ignore them. He didn't simply discount them or dismiss them. He wanted to understand. And so he took their arguments seriously and then would point out how they were wrong or partially true, or where they kind of went off the mark. So the capacity to engage the views of others fairly and critically, that's a strength of St. Thomas. The priority of truth, again, that statement that the point of all this is not to discover what so-and-so said or who's got the most power or influence, but what is true? How pressing is that question in our day, in the internet era, where everything seems to be true or everything seems to be false? We live in a postmodern worldview where we doubt that anybody really knows anything for sure. We'll see where that came from next time as well. And ultimately, what Aquinas teaches us is that the goal of human life is not to be rich or popular or famous or influential or smart or renowned, but to be holy. And you see this captured. This is the collect for the Feast of Aquinas, January 28th. O God, who made St. Thomas Aquinas outstanding in his zeal for holiness and his study of sacred doctrine, grant us, we pray, that we may understand what he taught and imitate what he accomplished. It always strikes me that holiness comes before learning in this prayer and in Aquinas' life. So Aquinas was a saint not because he was really smart, but because he used the gifts that God had given him for the sake of the kingdom of God, for the sake of the church, for the sake of his brothers and sisters in the human family. This wasn't about him. It was about helping others know the truth. And whatever our particular gifts or abilities or talents or influences, we can follow that same path. Maybe we won't understand everything Aquinas wrote, but we can be who we are to the best of our ability for the sake of others, and that also puts us in good company with Aquinas. He is often known as the Doctor Angelicus. He wrote a book which I read in the library at Rice University because it was the only place that had a copy. And Houston in the summertime was usually around 98 degrees and 99% humidity. And so for whatever reason, that library was like 60 degrees. And I expected like a thunderstorm in the entryway with these two air masses meeting, you know. I remember being really chilled, and not because it was so moving, reading Aquinas there. It was a book called De Spiritualis Creatoribus. It was all about the spiritual creatures, the intelligences, is what Aristotle called them. We would say the angels. And he went into great detail about the angels. Aquinas never wrote how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Don't believe all that. But that question in itself, well, it's often used as kind of dismissive commentary on medieval philosophy. Challenge anybody to answer that. What does that mean? Why is that important? Aquinas would tell you why that is important. Well, I like this picture because I don't know what those guys are doing. The one angel looks like, what the heck did you write here? You know. The one on the other side is, whoa, don't say that. And then the guy behind him, you see, has got his arms folded like, I dare you to write that. And Aquinas looks just a little bit annoyed. I'm not sure that was the artist's intention, but he's known as the angelic doctor because he had not only this love of the things of heaven, but also he wrote so much about the order of creation, including the angels. Okay. So I recommend to you a few resources. The book, a number of you have, from McInery, an introduction to a first glance at St. Thomas and a handbook for peeping Thomists. You can find that online. Amazon has some copies. I ordered some and people have picked them up. That's great. There's still some copies available. Yes?
Electronically from Barnes & Noble on their web service.
Oh.
I think it's on Amazon.
Like Nook or?
It's available on Kindle too, I believe.
On Kindle, okay. So you can check that out as well, but that's not free, right? You'd have to purchase the book.
Pardon? You can get the book electronically from Barnes & Noble or Kindle, purchasing it there.
Yeah. So don't feel obliged to do that. I'll give you some pages to read in that handout, some background, but we're not going to go slavishly through all of those pages. It just gives you a sense from an introductory point of view of where somewhat we've talked about this evening, why Aquinas matters. The biography of Aquinas by Chesterton is really very fine. Chesterton is not an easy read. You read like C.S. Lewis, if you're familiar with him, he's got some really pithy one-liners. Chesterton, you have to read a couple paragraphs to get to the pithy part. He's a kind of a more detailed writer, but he really is good at situating Aquinas in a fresh way in the Europe of his time, the church of his time, the philosophy and universities of his time. Joseph Pieper is a great philosopher as well, an admirer of Thomas. This one is Guide to Thomas Aquinas. He wrote, one of his most influential works probably is, it's about the virtues. Do you remember the title of it? Pieper's work on the virtues. I can't remember the title of it. Anyway, he goes into the virtues, prudence, fortitude, temperance, justice in great Thomistic detail. This one I've never read. Thomas Aquinas, scholar, poet, mystic saint. The poor Clares give me books, and luckily they don't quiz me. Copleston has really written a great series of the history of philosophy, and he has one short volume here. He's a Jesuit on just Aquinas. There's lots of books.
The Pieper book is Virtues and Vices of Courage.
Thank you. This is the Summa Contra Gentiles. My favorite chapter. These are old books. 1932. All in Latin. I haven't read it all. But my favorite chapter in the Summa Contra Gentiles is in Book 2. So for our comprehensive exams, we had to pick a couple books. I did Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy and Book 2 of Summa Contra Gentiles. And then you had to read them and prepare, and then they could ask you anything about those books. It was intimidating, to say the least. So you would hope that the questions were longer than the answers had to be. But anyway, in Book 2, Chapter 25, is things the all-powerful God cannot do. So there's the kind of old thing about, if God is all-powerful, can he make a stone so heavy he can't lift it? And Aquinas says, well, just because we can put nonsensical words together doesn't hold God responsible to do the impossible. But there's things that he says God cannot do. God cannot die. God cannot deceive us. God cannot fail. God cannot not love us. God cannot be defeated. God cannot suffer. God cannot have emotions as we do. So Aquinas would say God is not really compassionate the way we think of compassion. He has something better than that. It's hard for us to put our minds around that. But the most important, I think, is where he says God cannot make what has happened not to have happened. Even the all-powerful God can't erase history. So God is a redeemer. God forgives us, but he doesn't change our past. I often bring this up in the context of sacrament of reconciliation. It doesn't erase what has happened. It's marked in history. It's changed the order of everything ever since. But it doesn't bind us anymore. So even the all-powerful God can't erase time and history. There's a lot of gems like that in here. All the rest of that is the Summa Theologiae. And that's all in Latin. You can buy versions that are Latin and English translations. There's a number of English translations of the Summa. And Aquinas as I mentioned, he had this stroke, so he was not finished with the Summa when he had the stroke and stopped writing. He was in book part 3, the Tertia Pars, talking about penitence, and then, ironically, has this great suffering enter his life. So there's what's called the supplement. It was notes and lectures and things that he had done over time that his students put together. When you read the supplement, you say, this is not the same writer. It's so clear that it doesn't have the concise, insightful, sort of sequential reasoning. It represents, to some extent, the thought of Aquinas. But if you're a Thomistic scholar and you quote the supplement, people will sort of roll their eyes. Unless you say, this might not be the authentic thought of Aquinas, then they think you're smart. But if you just quote the supplement like it's Aquinas, they will mark you down. So that's kind of just a very brief introduction of who Aquinas was. Again, great scholar, philosopher, theologian, writer, but most of all, we honor him as a saint, someone who took the word and the world very seriously and wanted to understand them, not for himself, so that we could also understand and know God better. Questions, comments, corrections?
Father Chuck,
Yes.
You mentioned about the things that God cannot do.
Yes.
You mentioned God could not suffer. Could you explain that one?
So suffering, and again, this is Thomistic thought. Suffering is, we would say, a translation is passivity or passion. So the passion of the Lord, this is why it was so scandalous to the people of his time. How could God suffer and die on the cross? So passion, even emotion, like anger or sadness, those are things that happen to us. Nothing happens to God. God is the cause of all things. So God cannot experience things influencing from the outside. Suffering would be one of them. It'll all make sense once you follow Aquinas sequentially through his thinking. And we'll come to soon in the book there and the discussion about the 5 ways. It's one of the most familiar of Aquinas' arguments. How do you know that God exists? How do you prove God exists? He doesn't say they're proofs. He says they are ways to know the existence of God, that it's reasonable to believe that God exists. In fact, more reasonable to believe that God exists than that he doesn't. Because the very positing of God does not exist means you have some idea of what you're saying doesn't exist, and where does that idea come from? McInery will talk about that if you read the book right near the beginning. Seldom affirm, never deny, always make distinctions. That was one of Thomas's great sayings. So again, he took very seriously the thoughts and opinions and ideas of the people around him. He didn't just belittle them or make fun of them or dismiss them. He wanted to understand what they were seeing and where they might have gone off. That's a great form of charity in and of itself. And like your math teacher, he always showed his work. All right, thank you very much. So we will gather again next Sunday, and I'll have some handouts for you. We're going to go through a very irresponsibly brief flight through philosophical history, the kind of position Aquinas, what came before, why he was important at his time, and then what came after, and therefore why Aquinas is still so important to us today. And we'll talk about some basic philosophical concepts: being, cause, nature, virtue, natural law, being and becoming, all of those things that you dread. Hopefully they'll make some sense to you. Concepts that help read Aquinas. The other handout is just a very small piece from the first thing that Aquinas wrote. that we have. It's a book, De Ente et Essentia, on being and essence. And as he says there, a small error at the beginning causes great problems at the end. And so we have to start at the very beginning and understand what we mean by being. And so he goes through, this is a fairly short book, but people still can't figure out quite exactly what he was getting at. It's so deep and profound about being, essence, existence, and the fact that God alone has his essence is his existence. Father Matthew Crane and I had this argument. One of the prayers for the funeral mass, the collect says, "O God, whose nature is always to forgive and have mercy." And I said, oh, St. Thomas wouldn't like that. God does not have a nature. There is no nature in God, strictly speaking, because nature means birth, comes from the word natus or nata. God is not born. God didn't have a beginning. Father Matthew was not impressed with me. I was not unused to that. We got in an argument one evening after, not an argument, discussion about something after a parish council meeting. And Father Matthew is a great John Henry Newman scholar. And so he was quoting Newman to me. And I said, I've been Catholic longer than Newman ever was. Because he converted when he was 45 and lived to 90. He had to acknowledge that's true. Didn't agree I was right, but he had to acknowledge that at least was true. Thank you. I'm sorry we don't have snacks. We can't do that. Thanks, Joe, for the technology. Oh, there's one left. Yeah, I can take it because I